Hi, everyone. I can give everyone a few minutes to get on their camera. For attendance, of course, this is the home stretch. Let me see. I'm also going to share my screen. Oh, sorry. I feel like I knocked this. I feel like look like I'm selling some car insurance with this guy on. Feels very foreign. Alrighty, let me get my screen shared and we'll get started in a few minutes. Ugh, converting the other guy. I don't know how to minimize this. Oops. You guys can see this on my screen, I hope. Perfect. Thank you. We'll get here. It's been a long day, everybody, but this is the home stretch. Woohoo! Just think it's like the consolidated version of what we were just doing for the last 5 hours. So, for real, the home stretch. Let's see. I'll give people like 2 or 3, like we'll start at 4:05, so 3 more minutes just to get back and get ready to rumble.
Hey, Chrissy.
Yes.
I have a really random question. I'm looking at the agenda. So I'm in Mountain Time right now. So I'm 2 hours behind you guys, but one
Okay.
hour behind Central. So it says on the agenda, this ends at 5. So it'll be 4 Central and 6 for you guys.
Yep.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm all backwards with time. I told
I
the
know.
last
Wait a
group to
minute.
get
What time
back
does
at
this end?
I told the last
Yeah.
group for lunch to get back by 1:45 and it was really 12:45 and Becky almost
It's like,
had my
oh,
head. So
the longest
it was
lunch. Yeah.
1:45 for me. Everybody
Thank
else,
you.
sorry, no problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, I got the timeline and I was ready at 8 o'clock, and I was like, oh, this is not 8 o'clock for me. This is 9 o'clock. So
Yeah.
we're finishing at 6, not 5. That makes much more sense.
Yeah. I saw that I saw in your previous PowerPoint slides. I didn't go to the audiology one, but you're an ed-aud also?
Yeah,
Yep.
by just for one day a week, it's
Okay.
something rather new and rather fun at an auditory oral school across the street
Good.
that's located on campus.
Very cool.
Yes, so it's very interesting to bring the two
It's
worlds together
it's a
for sure.
totally different hat. Yeah,
Oh yeah,
it really is.
for sure. Literally
Perfect.
different hat for sure. Did everyone enjoy Sarah's piece? That she got big brain, lots of things, lots of experiences. It's pretty incredible. Alrighty, well, we'll get started, and as people trickle in, they will trickle in. So, hi again, everybody. Long time no see. Like I mentioned before, my name is Chrissy. My full name is Gisanda Sanchez. I am a pediatric audiologist at the University of Miami Ear Institute and the interim director of our Children's Hearing Program, which is a multidisciplinary team committed to helping children with hearing loss and their families navigate the hearing loss journey. Our multidisciplinary team is actually pretty unique. We have a team of 2 psychologists, 2 auditory verbal therapists, a social worker, an educational specialist, and then 3 pediatric audiologists, plus 6 neuro-otologists. So a pretty comprehensive team, but we're definitely dedicated to addressing the whole child, not just their hearing, not just their ears, and their families. These are my disclosures. So, yep, just like you mentioned, I do work in part, and part of my salary is paid for by the Department of Health and Department of Education to serve as an educational audiologist at an auditory oral school, which we have on campus called the Debbie School. It is an auditory oral program, and they have about 45 students who have hearing loss and use a variety of devices. That's probably my most challenging clinical day because getting all these kids on different FM systems, getting the teachers educated on how to do them is a whole different beast than what I do on my other day to day tasks, of course. So, we're going to briefly review a lot of the things that we talked about earlier, and I'm sure highlighting a lot of the things that Sarah discussed, but kind of translate it more to the audiology side and counseling and the diagnosis of hearing loss. So, I was assuming as interventionists and as therapists and as teachers of the deaf, pretty much we would be as audiologists, we're the first line of that communication. Once that diagnosis happens, then we hope to get all the resources of all of you, right, of early intervention, of speech, of getting kids with their itinerant teachers and all the services that they are, they qualify for. But I kind of like to start at the basics of the counseling level, because for sure it how we convey that message, especially with the Spanish speaking population, is pretty important and kind of will navigate the trajectory of their outcomes and how they proceed with this hearing loss journey. So I already did a little brief about me. I did go to the University of Florida. Uh, Go Gators, don't tell my employer. But a lot of, and I mentioned this to the first group, but a lot of just being bilingual doesn't innately make me passionate about working with Spanish speaking people. I'm sure people will feel the same way. Just because you know a language doesn't necessarily mean you're so passionate about it, implementing service and a service line for this population. But at UF, their audiology program goes to Mexico every year on a humanitarian trip called Project Yucatan. And me going to that trip really made me realize the disparities in healthcare, not only that were given in Mexico compared to the United States, which are obviously different, but even just providing healthcare to exclusively Spanish speaking families, to resources that they may or may have access to. It was just a whole different world. And it definitely filled this little hole, like in your space in your heart, that you didn't know could be filled by something like that. And that's like where that has its niche for. And it really kind of navigated the trajectory of where I wanted to have my career. I definitely wanted to, being Hispanic, of course, coming back home is important to our culture, as we alluded to, having this family dynamic. And these are my abuelitas, and this is my extended family, and then over here is my nieces, who couldn't convey their personalities even better in one photo representing the University of Miami. But family is really big for us, and so I wanted to make sure that when I got a job near home, that I was doing what I was passionate about, and that was really providing access to resources to those who speak Spanish and are of my culture. So I want to briefly talk about language across the United States, and where we stand and how they look. So obviously English is the most predominant language spoken in the United States, followed by Spanish, then Chinese, then Tagalog, Vietnamese, French, Korean, German, Arabic, and Russian. Compared to the world, I love to use these data and look at them compared to just the United States alone, United States compared to the world. The top 10 native languages across the world actually are, the top three would be Chinese, Spanish, and English. But if we look at number of speakers, there are more English speakers in the world than anything else, which would imply that English is largely spoken as a second language, if not as a primary language. As a primary language, it's third most spoken, but as a second language, it seems to be, in total number of speakers, the most predominantly spoken language across individuals. And I wanted to see how this language disparity compared to that of the United States. And it turns out that of the world's top languages, the United States shares six of them, being English, Chinese, Spanish, French, Arabic, and Russian. So, um, pretty much a testament to saying that obviously why the United States doesn't have a native language, or one of only a few countries that don't have a native language. And we're pretty much melting pot of cultures. And I know these percentages here look really minimal, but these percentages represent a lot of people, big number of people. And then I wanted to see, of those who classified themselves as speaking Spanish or English or Chinese or what so have you, how well do they actually speak English as that second language? This is a Likert scale that's provided by the survey. So, but I only use the two extremes, as I don't speak it or I speak it very well, because the other two are very subjective to just personal choice. What I wanted to highlight here is Spanish and Chinese being those two top languages spoken. And about 50% of those populations don't actually feel comfortable speaking English. So it would imply that of that population, 50% of these speakers are actually monolingual Spanish speakers or monolingual Chinese speakers, which is really important to know, that they're not necessarily English spoken as a second language, that they're truly monolingual speakers. And so where are they located? I'm a little bit of a PowerPoint weirdo, and I really love like focusing on my PowerPoint and looks of it. So I made this little appearance that these states will light up, and hopefully it works, it doesn't glitch out. But I wanted to highlight, obviously, this is the map of the United States and where these Chinese speakers are located by and large. It makes up only 1% of our population, but it actually totals to about 3% of California's population, nearly 3% of New York's population, 2.5% of Hawaii's population, 1.7% of Massachusetts population, 1.3% of New Jersey, 1.3% of Washington, 1.1% of Maryland, and 1.1% of Nevada's population. So that 1% of Chinese speakers is actually spread very much around the United States. Now, these are just states that represent more than the national average, so having more than 1% of their state speaking that language. When we look at Spanish, of course, there's a lot more spread. We makes up for 12.9, which totals to over 40 million speakers. So 13% really is a lot of people. 40 million speakers are speaking Spanish. They're located largely in Texas, California, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Florida, New Jersey, New York, and Illinois. And Illinois is largely in the Chicago area. And I wanted to break it down a little bit further because knowing the states is great, but kind of figuring out what cities they're located in is probably even better. And so the top of this, the city that has the largest amount of Spanish speakers would be Miami, Florida, where 70% of their population is Spanish speaking. 69% of El Paso, Texas's population is Spanish speaking, followed by Los Angeles having 43.1%, San Antonio having 41%, and Dallas having 37% of their population being Spanish speaking. And these demographics are really telling of something probably much larger than itself. This is census data taken from 2011. If I gave this presentation, in 6 months and had the 2020 data, I could only imagine that this increase since 1990 has been 133.4% increase in Spanish speakers. But you take that data in 6 months from now, and you add another 10 years to this data, and who knows, the spread could be much larger. What about Texas? So a lot of people on this presentation are living in Texas, and I like to do my research on the locals, of course. But Texas, this 29.5% actually is totals to about 7.37 million people speaking Spanish. That is a lot of people, and Texas is a very large state. A lot of these are percentages of total population by place. So highlighted aren't the counties, however, listed are the cities with their counties. And these are cities and counties with people that have over 80% of their populations being Spanish speaking. So we have Laredo, Brownsville, Pharr, Edinburgh, Mission, McAllen, El Paso, largely encompassed by Hidalgo County, Cameron and Webb County as well, all highlighted here. Then with counties and cities with over 50% of their population are highlighted here: Pasadena, San Antonio, Corpus Christi, Odessa. And what was really interesting for me is that the Hidalgo, Bexar, Dallas, and Harris counties, which are circled here, actually account for 7 million Spanish-speaking people on their own. To me, not being a native Texan and only having been to Texas once, these counties look so itty-bitty and make up so many people who speak Spanish. So obviously the population is very concentrated, as it is in many places, but for sure, Texas representing the state with the largest amount of Spanish speakers, it's really important to have resources for these patients. What about providers? So we know that there's 40 million people in the United States who are speaking Spanish, 7 million who are located right in the heart of Texas. So what do we do? The answer, of course, isn't as simple as become a Spanish-speaking audiologist, or in your case, become a Spanish-speaking provider, a speech therapist, interventionist, whatever it may be. And we know that this is not reasonable. As we mentioned early in our talk, bilingual audiology and speech providers make up only 6% of the field, and Spanish providers only make up 4% of the field. Now, this is not a reflection of maybe audiology in itself, because this is obtained by ASHA. However, we know that there are a lot more speech therapists than there are audiologists. So the percentage, while the number is not reflective of audiology as a field on its own, the percentage is probably pretty comparable, given that there are far more speech therapists than there are audiologists. Now, I live in Florida, and my clinic is also a giant hub for a lot of Spanish speaking patients. As we know, 80% of Miami-Dade County, which is right down here, is Spanish speaking. And it's interesting because that is the difference of becoming when a minority becomes a majority, I suppose. And growing up, I never felt like I was part of a minority, and that's probably why, because I come from a location where 80% of us are speaking Spanish as well. Our clinic actually in this little area, we have three major clinics in our area in Miami-Dade County, but we also have the Tri-County area over here, which is Palm Beach, Broward, and Palm Beach, Broward County, and then Monroe is just south of Miami-Dade County. And we have clinics, three additional clinics in those northern clinics. The patients we serve, however, come from a lot of places, including the whole West Coast and further north of Palm Beach. And just to give you a reference point, Palm Beach to Miami can take almost nearly 2 hours, is a 2 hour drive, just to give you a distance point. And to go west is usually standard because you have to go north to go west, because if not, you hit the Everglades and there's no roads there, of course. It's about a 3 hour drive. So on standard, if you're not living in Miami-Dade County, plus with the traffic, it's quite a trek to get to our clinic. Um, Obviously, north of the state, we don't see too many patients routinely, although we will. And that's largely because right here is Orlando, home of Disney World. Great place to be. But Orlando does have a lot of clinics on our own that see pediatrics. And so we usually see a lot of patients just north of Orlando. I mean, just sorry, south of Orlando. It's been a long day. Um, and we have a lot of providers. And I see someone just wrote in the chat of El Paso's population and how many providers are there. Let me see here. It says we have 600,000 people in El Paso and one specific pediatric audiologist. Pediatric audiologist. Holy moly, that's no bueno. That's a lot of work for one person, and for sure the need for bilingual providers is huge. I know Sarah kind of inched at the fact that maybe Miami was hogging them. I wouldn't say that we're hogging them because we're also in need of care too, but we definitely have these handful of audiologists. We have an audiology extern and a fellow. And then we also have the members of our multidisciplinary team, which I alluded to before. And of them, 56% of them are bilingual. 22% are trilingual, which is pretty impressive. However, I am the lone pediatric provider who is also Spanish speaking. So I feel the pain. And while my team is largely Spanish speaking, I'm the only one assigned to our clinic who's to see pediatrics and families who speak Spanish. However, it does take a village to run a clinic, as you all may know, and it's really important that staff members speak Spanish. So we have a lot of clinical coordinators that run different assets such as pediatrics, cochlear implants, hearing aids, and the clinic itself. And then we have clinical assistants dedicated to different specialties. Oh, Miss Maggie here. She doesn't have blue hair anymore, but it was really cool. The kids loved it. But we have clinical assistants dedicated to different specialties such as hearing aids, pediatrics, cochlear implants. She's actually a bilateral cochlear implant recipient. And the point of this is just to showcase that we have 15 staff members on our team and all of them speak Spanish, and 9 of them are actually interpreter certified, which definitely helps our clinic flow significantly. I'm only alluding to this because it takes a village and it's just far beyond the provider. Once you get to the provider, that's its own challenge, but getting access to healthcare, getting the right appointment, getting the instructions, doing all that, it already takes a village. So having a staff that's equipped and has the language to do so really makes it substantially easier to get these patients through the system. Um, this is just to show that obviously we see a lot of Spanish speaking patients in our clinic. Just looking at a month in my clinical load, I saw 147 total encounters, 129 of which were for non-English speaking patients, 88% of which totals to 88%, which is a lot of my day just functioning in different language, largely in Spanish. And I didn't learn audiology in Spanish, so sometimes it can be challenging. And as we mentioned before, I'll skip right through this. We do have a big international outreach. So we see a lot of international patients that come from very far to see us. And the pressure's on in those instances. If you guys have had any experience working with international patients, it's like, oh, you're leaving, tomorrow and you wanted a cochlear implant. Got it. So we have to kind of scramble and figure out how we can get them the best resources we can in the very short time window. But in order to take all of this obviously seriously and apply it clinically, we really just need to understand cultural competency at a much deeper level. What it really means to be culturally competent. We want the ability to understand, communicate with, and effectively interact with people across several cultures. It encompasses being aware of your own worldview and aware of your own culturally learned assumptions, some of which may be biased, and that's okay. Developing positive attitudes towards cultural differences, gaining knowledge of different cultures and practices and worldviews, and developing skills for communication and interaction across cultures. Culture competency in itself is not static, and our level of cultural competence may change. It may ebb and flow in response to new situations, new experiences, new relationships met with people. There are three major elements to the fundamentals of cultural competence, which include awareness and attitude, the knowledge, and the skills. And I won't go into too much detail about this, but obviously it's far more than just understanding that someone comes from a different background. Understanding to not take offense when people of one culture want to be seen by people of their same culture, and understanding your own limits as a provider who may not communicate with, may not be able to communicate with their family, and knowing your own limits and being like, you maybe should be seen by somebody who can better test you or better assess your language or whatever the case may be in regards to that. And before we can address barriers and differences to working with the Hispanic culture, we actually need to understand what makes this culture so unique. We briefed family tradition being very, very big in this culture, and I'm going to talk about the machismo and the marianismo roles, which are always fun to talk about. I'll talk about religion briefly, and I'll talk about etiquette. So, la familia. Family is the most important social unit in the Hispanic culture. The family unit extends beyond immediate families and often includes extended family. So, just beyond, it's not just mom and dad, it's abuela, it's abuelo, it's tia, it's primo, it's madrina. It's like we have cousins that are also our godparents at the same time. It's very much a diverse community that comes together and sticks with the family. We're very tightly knit. So there's a sense of moral responsibility within the Hispanic families to aid other family members who may experience financial hardship, unemployment, health conditions, or any other issues. News gets around very fast within the Hispanic families as well. And the father role is usually the head of the family. He's usually the bread maker, the provider, and mother is usually responsible for the home and the children. And preserving the Spanish language within the family is common practice. This is something that, hearing loss or not, is very important to families of Hispanic culture. And I just remember, I alluded this story last time, but my two nieces, my oldest niece, she's now 10. And, growing up myself, while Spanish was my first language, I was very quickly exposed to English because my older siblings were already school age when I was born. And usually what happens is that before you're school age, Spanish families tend to exclusively communicate Spanish at home. And then, of course, they leave school to learning the English. Well, since my siblings were already English speaking, there was a lot more Spanglish in my home, of course. And now that my niece is born, that's another generation that's more US acculturated. And my niece has just associated speaking Spanish with being old. And so every time we make her speak Spanish, she thinks that means that she's going to get old, just like our grandmas, which are our great grandmas. And it's been this really big conundrum. But she's old enough now. She's actually in a dual language program and achieving her fluency in Spanish. But it was a struggle. It's a struggle for them to learn it when it's not commonplace in your current family dynamic. And I now want to talk about machismo and marianismo roles. The sociocultural scripts of male and female gender role socialization in Hispanic culture are referred to respectively as machismo and marianismo. Machismo describes beliefs and expectations regarding the role of men. This includes a set of values, attitudes, and beliefs about masculinity or what it means to be a man. It encompasses both positive and negative aspects of masculinity, which include bravery, honor, dominance, aggression, sexism, reserved emotions, amongst others. And it also includes the attitudinal beliefs that consider it appropriate for women to remain in traditional roles, encouraging male dominance over women. Now, whether you as a woman or a male believe in this is almost, not that it's irrelevant, but it just alludes to the fact that this does surely exist, and whether you support it or not, these roles are still very, very much relevant and very much present in the Hispanic culture. The counterpart to the machismo is, and what you would refer to a man who carries this role, he would be called the machista, just to give you a reference. preference. And the counterpart to a machista would be a marianista, but the role itself is called a marianismo, which concerns the traditional female role. It emphasizes the role of women as family and home centered and encourages passivity, self sacrifice, and chastity. A marianista depicts a woman in nurturing roles and prescribes respect for patriarchal views. Why is this relevant? Well, it should fundamentally structure how you diagnose hearing loss, counsel families, recommend treatment plans, onboard them onto their hearing loss journey. And there's really a lot of things to consider at this point. The mother bringing the child, the father is not always at the appointments. You want to consider the level of education of the mom and her IQ, the mother receiving the information. The mother may be the main caregiver, but is she always the decision maker? A lot of times, my default recommendation for anything, if I only see one caregiver and they happen to be of the Hispanic culture, is I say, I know you need to bring this back home and talk to your family, or would you like to bring this home to talk to your family and make a decision then? And more often than not, it's a yep, that's what I need to do. And so this kind of alludes to a take on recommendations. Last week, or about 2 weeks ago, I saw two children who were diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. And if anyone here has worked with children who have autism, you know that it is hard to do much with them, especially a structured hearing test when children don't like their ears being touched. I made the same recommendation for both children. I recommended an ABR under general anesthesia. And let me tell you, that is me putting up a fight because I try my hardest to get something. And sometimes I have to call quits and wave my white flag and say, I, I didn't get anything. And that was my day that day. And one child was of Hispanic descent and one child was of Caucasian. And so one child came with his mom, Latina mom, and I made all of the sentiments about how this ABR needed to be under anesthesia. Unfortunately, our group does not provide ABRs under sedation, which would be probably less invasive and less risky. And I said, I know you probably have to bring this home to your family to make this decision, but this is the only way that we're really going to get ear specific information and better understand your child's hearing sensitivity. And she said, you're right. I need to talk to my husband. I also need to talk to my parents and the rest of my kids to make this decision. So she really isn't, it's not that she's unable to make a decision by herself, but they really, really look onto the advice of their families to make decisions for people that are not themselves, right? For a child. Whereas following this, I made the same recommendation to this mom. I said, I know you probably want to bring this back to your family and decide, how to move forward with this ABR, but this would be my next recommendation. And she said, I'm making the unilateral decision and when we're doing this. So when can we get it done? And I was like, oh. And it was such a unique moment for me because, it was a stark difference and it just happened back to back. So it was definitely, I had a clear cut comparison of just simple reactions. She's like, I appreciate you telling me that I have to take it home, but I'll talk to my husband later. It's fine. It's happening. And it was very quick that she was making decisions and that was okay. And that's just truly just this cultural decision and a cultural difference in just the same exact case, just handled by two different cultures. So, what about religion? We talked about this and we talked about prayer and the power of prayer. But religion does take a really, really big role in this navigation of the system. Belief in God healing on his own terms is major part of this religion. Spiritual and religious influences may play a major role in health and illness and in life. Most use primary care as a source of health care, while others may prefer to use home remedies and may consult folk healers such as curanderos. And I consider it more of like holistic healing, not necessarily just folk healing, but it definitely can go to that extreme. There's usually a hierarchy of seeking relief. Sometimes we'll start with a home remedy, whether it's rubbing garlic. Vicks Vapor Rub is a very common common remedy for everything. Oh, your nose hurts, put it up your nose. You have a cough, put it on your chest. You're feeling sick, put it on the bottom of your feet and put on socks. I mean, I've been lathered in Vicks as a child. You may want to seek out relatives. So they may want to say, oh, well, I know my cousin had a son who had an ear infection and maybe she kept the ear drops that we used. And even if they're expired, it's just very common practice to keep medicines and share that stuff. Obviously obviously not significantly strong medications, but things like, oh, for an ear infection or something like that. They may seek herbal or more holistic healings. And then they might go to a true folk healer, and then they might go see an actual doctor for their concerns. Like we said, medications are often shared with different social networks. Not that we advise it, but it happens. And a sick person may simultaneously use a lot of things. They may use prayer, folk and herbal medicine, a combination of prescription medications from a friend, and then also prescription medications from the clinic as well. Now, these are all sorts of alternative treatment that I have been shown in the clinic and have been personally asked if they work. This is some Chinese medication from Amazon. I do not recommend. Could not even read the ingredients. And I was like, "You're giving this to your child?" And she's like, "Yeah." And I was like, "But what are the ingredients?" She's like, "I don't know." And I was like, "Okay, I don't. That's not what we advise. Nope, nope." Goat's milk. Ooh, this one was fun. This mom was putting goat's milk in her child's ear every night, letting him sleep, and then she insisted that I tested his hearing, and no resolution to no one's surprise. But it was really hard for me to counsel that mom. Vicks, this is classic Vicks. I have had people put Vicks in their ears, and I was like, dear Lord, that must hurt because it hurts going up your nose. I can only imagine in your ears. And then these beads, and I won't go into it too much, but at its most extreme level, we've had patients who have, transitioned their religious belief to more Santeria, which is, if anyone has heard of Santeria practice, it's an Afro-Cuban descent in the 16th and 19th centuries. When the slave trade happened, African enslaved convinced Cubans that these gods were also part of Catholicism and also saints that should be worshipped. And what they are is just other deities and different gods of everything. And they're called orishas. And they represent everything. There's a god of thunder, god of lightning, god of luck, god of healing. And oftentimes the religion itself is extremism and very sacrificial. They sacrifice animals, they may sacrifice other things, and they sacrifice humans, but not to the point of death sacrifice. That's not what I mean. But oftentimes we will have families sacrifice their children to be spiritually healed, meaning that they convert their children to Santeria. So these kids are also called Santeros, even though they don't really have their own decision made, but in exchange for the gods to heal them of their hearing loss. So I've had many patients come, and we know that they have transitioned because for their first year of their sacrifice, they wear all white. They'll wear a white hat, well, a white dressed head to toe, and then they wear these beads around their neck. And they usually like very sacrificially cut their hair in some weird way. Like it doesn't look like you went to a salon to cut it. So, much more common in the Cuban culture. So we see this a lot in Miami. It's actually believed that 50% of people who actually still live in Cuba have some form of Santeria practice in their religion, but largely it's Catholicism. But just to talk about the extremes, because they're real and they happen. There's a lot of folk medicine too that I talked about prior. Folk medicine, a lot of people believe in the mal de ojo, which is called the evil eye. And the evil eye is not necessarily it's either someone who's looking at somebody either maliciously or they are looking at them in a place of like adoringness. And a lot of parents do it to protect their children. So if they notice someone who's looking over their child being like, oh, how cute, I love them, they're so beautiful, sometimes that reaction to Hispanic children makes Hispanic parents very uncomfortable, because it looks like you're summoning the evil eye on them. And so there's these weird remedies that happen that you have to put eggs on their stomach and then put it under their bed, or you get what's called an azabache, which is a little pin that has a little black jewel that wards the evil eye away from your children. So sometimes you'll see little Hispanic children with a little gold safety pin, or sometimes it's just a safety pin, if you, in lieu of an actual azabache, but you'll see them with safety pins on their back, or they'll have a little bracelet that has an azabache on there, and it's a little gold pendant. So just if you notice it, you're like, oh, interesting. It's all into folk medicine. And that's one of the more common folk medicine, folk beliefs that happen in the Hispanic culture. Etiquette is also huge to understand who and what and when to wait to say the certain thing to a person. Spanish speakers use varied degrees of formality depending on who and what the circumstances pertain to. So usually a kiss on the cheek is a very common greeting. Sometimes it happens for complete strangers depending on what culture you're from, what country you're from, and sometimes it happens only when you have some form of understanding of each other and you've met each other before. The same thing with using the words tú versus usted versus vos. The formality varies. And in non-formal settings and once people are comfortable, Hispanic people are usually very loud. They use a lot of their hand gestures, distinct body language to communicate what they'd like. And Hispanic people tend to be more relaxed and flexible about time and punctuality than other than other groups. So not being on time is actually a socially accepted behavior, which leads me to believe a quick poll that you guys can type in your chat if you'd like. How do you guys handle late appointments? Do you eventually see patients? Do you allow them to come 10 minutes late? Do you say it's half of the appointment? If they miss half the appointment, they're gone. You'll see them eventually. We'll try to see them, see them. Nice. So the majority of you, even if they show up late, will try to see them. Yeah, if that were the case with me, I'd be working till like 8 p.m. because some of my families are showing up 50 minutes late for their hour-long appointment. Some providers won't see them for the remaining of, yep, that's great. Call, text when they're 5 minutes late. They usually show up within a few minutes. That's great. Yeah, and obviously for therapy, it may be different, right? That's something a little more routine that happens. So the families are more familiar with coming to their appointments and they know, and you probably get a better familiarity with the family if they're routinely late patients or if they're like, if they're not late, typically that's probably warrants like a phone call, like, hey, what happened? For me, on the other hand, seeing patients maybe once every 6 months, once every 3 months, I get late offenders all the time. And it's hard because I like to see them in the time that they've allowed for, but sometimes I just don't have the time to do it. And then they come back and it just becomes a mess. But it's funny because we have an audiology fellow, and he is from Ohio, and he came to Miami, and he doesn't speak Spanish, but he said that he's never seen a group of people so committed to attending their appointment, even if it was 50 minutes late for an hour-long appointment. Like they will show up. They don't have any shame in showing up, but there's only like 10 minutes left, and that's the time that it takes for like the front to check them in, and then they're like, well, you missed your entire appointment, but they will still show up. So it's definitely a cultural thing, and a cultural thing that probably should be managed up front when you're establishing care with that family to kind of set guidelines, because while they understand that it could be socially acceptable to be late to more social gatherings, from a medical standpoint, there are so many hours in the clinic that you can provide care. And not only can you compromise their child's care, but you're compromising someone else's care too by running late into their appointment as well. And so that comes into, now we're going to talk a little bit about using interpreters for testing and for clinic use. And before we dive into the nitty gritty, who has been in this situation? How many times you have explained something lengthy to a patient via an interpreter, and they reply with one or two word utterances, and you're just like, I definitely said something much longer than that. And at first you're like probably super skeptic, and you're like, this doesn't seem very right. I'm pretty certain that I said something longer. And then what do you do? I mean, unless you have you have the courage to confront the interpreter, right? Unless you have the courage to say, okay, can you repeat what I just said? Or can they repeat what you just said to you, and you repeat it back? Most of the time it's just more of an acceptance, and you just move on, and you're like, all righty then. And so, yep. So a lot of people are saying usually it goes the other way. I asked the interpreter what they told the family, and and it's important because a lot of times we don't even know the language level. We don't know the level of education of our interpreter either. So it's like really hard. You're dealing with two kind of unknowns when you're communicating with your patients, and so that just makes it even harder. You're communicating with your patient, and then you're communicating through someone you don't even know, like their literacy, their understanding, any of that. And you would hope that through an interpreter there's some guidelines, and I would love to tell you that everyone follows these really strict certifications, but unfortunately they don't. In my minimal research on interpretation, there is research out there on using interpreters, of course, and encounters with in-person interpretation were rated significantly higher by providers and interpreters. That's obvious. Having someone in-house is much better than via phone, whereas phone interpretation was rated significantly worse and shorter than in-person encounters. Makes sense, obviously, all this data. And the quality of care was deemed to be inferior, and most interpreter errors occurred with untrained interpreters, which is interesting because I didn't know what it took to actually train an interpreter. In fact, little nugget of knowledge, I'm actually a certified interpreter for the University of Miami, but I am not a trained interpreter by any means, which is a little bit scary because I don't want them sending me to no dialysis clinic and I have to translate for somebody because I'm not going to know what I have to say, because just because I speak Spanish doesn't mean I'm qualified to talk about anyone's kidney function. That's for sure. I don't feel comfortable doing so, and I wouldn't even know where to start. And it's interesting because my test to be an interpreter was a paragraph that I had to translate about an Asian man who broke his wrist and then died because nobody could speak Vietnamese. And I had to interpret that in Spanish, which was very strange. Um, but just to show you, like, even within my own institution, and we're not hired as interpreters, so it's a different story. We're just qualified to interpret, but there is some guidelines on interpretation. However, when I looked for jobs that actually required that certification for interpreting, only two of them out of the 25 jobs that I looked at actually required the certification, and more jobs actually required a weightlifting criteria, like people must be able to lift a certain amount of pounds in order to have this job, which was very interesting. I don't know what kind of um, what they're lifting. And it also made me think of, like, what is an untrained interpreter? What is a trained interpreter? And it makes you think, even in the clinic, what's happening when you get an interpreter, and what's their level of competence. And another thing to keep in mind, obviously, interpreting is just playing a giant game of telephone. So you're thinking about literally things getting lost in translation. Um, and so having people having to reverse translate and forward translate things is very challenging, especially being bilingual and changing your, code switching and changing your dialect from one second to another. I find myself, even when I interpret, I end up speaking the wrong language to the wrong parties, and I'm like, oh, sorry, I don't even know why I'm speaking Spanish to you. You're the English speaker, but it happens, and it's just a matter of your brain capacity at some point. But another thing to think of is level of education. So, level of education not only of your interpreter, but of the person on the receiving end of all this information. Now, this patient has two people that they're receiving information from, coming from one language they don't understand to a language that they do understand. But is that person translating it at a level of literacy that they understand? It's important to note that the percent of racial or ethnic group lacking a high school diploma is pretty astounding in the Hispanic population. In fact, nearly 75% of Hispanic people in 2011, of course, ages 25 and over, did not have a high school diploma, which is a really, really big number. And that's at 25 and up, meaning you average graduate high school, at 17, 18. So that's giving them a 7 year window to get a comparable degree. And even then, 75% of this population doesn't have the education of a high school graduate. And where are those people located? No surprise here. These last pins are where the most predominant Spanish speakers are located, and not surprisingly, they're located in Miami, Dallas, Los Angeles, and El Paso. Four of the top five Spanish-speaking cities account for the locations with the largest Hispanic population lacking a high school diploma. So that's really important to know, that even our population is 70% Spanish-speaking, and 30% of them don't even have the education of a high school graduate. So just things to think about as you're counseling, and using appropriate language and understanding, and breaking it down to a level that's really simplified is really, really important, especially when you're going through a third party to get that message across. So how do we counsel these families then, right? How do we get from one step beyond the audiogram and embark on intervention, embark on the diagnosis, and how do we get them to embark on their hearing loss journey? And what about if and when we meet resistance? What do we actually do in that point? Because we talked about how these major roles play a part in family roles, right? I'm talking to the mom, but the dad, who is against everything, is making the decision, is not even in my appointment. There's a lot of resistance that happens. And so we often try to break these barriers by understanding the cultural differences. Our job is to educate and empower families to make the best decision for their children with their preferred communication method in mind. Our multidisciplinary team has trained us as audiologists to use the tool of motivational interviewing to get the resistance out of the way and talk about the meat of the problem. And I'll briefly talk about what motivational interviewing is. So, motivational interviewing is a counseling method that helps people resolve ambivalent feelings and insecurities to find the internal motivation they need to change their behavior and to move forward with a decision. So, oftentimes, as you know, with the 5 stages of grief, anger, denial, acceptance, bargaining, depression, a lot of a lot of times there's a lot of research to suggest that actually the Hispanic culture doesn't ever reach acceptance in the same trajectory that the average person might. They actually go back and forth. They may go to acceptance and then go back to bargaining. They may be in denial for a very long time and then go back to bargaining and then be angry about it. And so this same level happens when you're doing motivational interviewing. You may talk to a parent one day and they're at the I can do it stage, and then you talk to them next week and they won't do it. They talk to a cousin and they're out. They're not interested in talking about it anymore. And so having a tool and having the reference of motivational interviewing is a good tool to have in your toolbox. But how can our experiences help? We come from a clinic that's very, very profound with using Spanish speakers. And, my job here is to tell you all when you see an audiogram and it says could not test, I assure you that the more I get this message out there, the better I hope that things will be, because I assure you that there is a means of testing children who speak Spanish. Even if we lack tools, even if we lack resources, they exist and you can do it. If we just have to be creative enough to do it, and you have to be willing and humble enough and have enough humility to do it yourself, and that's okay. We're going to talk about modifying current tests and the clinical tools that are available, and implementing newer tests, and how to maximize use of an interpreter, and showcase some example cases. So we have 15 minutes, and in these 15 minutes, I want to talk about what happens when we test people in Spanish versus English. English has more consonants, and Spanish has more multisyllabic words. Therefore, Spanish has a steeper psychometric function, and what that means is there's a higher ceiling effect. When we test people in Spanish who are Spanish speakers, they actually perform better than if they were English speakers. So that way, what happens is that we actually underestimate the communication difficulties because they perform better no matter what. No matter their hearing sensitivity, Spanish is just easier to receptively understand than English is. So we have to consider these things. Some English, we have to consider these things when actually making decisions. There's a lot of some English words can mean several things in Spanish. And these two videos, which I'll skip, they're very short anyway, is just children trying to identify the frog in Spanish. And this child only identifies the frog as rana, which is appropriate. And this child only identifies the frog as sapo, which I would consider a toad, but he doesn't identify the word rana at all. He only knows it as sapo, which is a very, very small example into the glimpse of there's many words and many things can have many meanings. And so it's not a simple translation. You can't just say, well, this translates to this, because you're like, well, actually in English that has like 3 words and in Spanish it has 5. So it doesn't quite translate the way it would. And sometimes it does though. So sometimes we can take an English word and add an an or an o to it, and then say that English word with a strong Spanish accent, and you've actually correctly said an understood Spanish word. For example, this is un abrigo in Spanish, but it would be maybe una chaqueta, which would be maybe a jacket with an A, or un suéter. A lot of times commonly use un suéter, ponte un suéter, abrígate. Also a chaqueta. Uh, these we would call chores commonly. They're formally called pantalones cortos, but nobody has any time to say that long word for shorts. This one is always fun. Parking is called estacionamiento, but again, it's a very long word, so we just often say parquea el carro, parquea. Um, a fax or printing, we often say printea or faxéamelo. That is really wrong. It's imprimir, but it's still commonly known. So if you were to say that, people would actually understand what you're saying. And then these are zapatos, of course, but they're commonly used as tenis, like tennis shoes, ponte los tenis. And then sometimes we use the name brand of an item, just like we would in English. You refer to a tissue as a Kleenex, or if you go to the outside to throw something away in the dumpster. Did you know that dumpster was a name brand? Didn't know that until I did some research. But so these things are, have their own name brand, and sometimes we refer to certain Spanish things by their name brand. For example, chicle. Chicle is the name brand of a gum, but it's also how we refer to all gums. So every gum is a chicle. Every gum is a chiclet. Frigidaire. While there's other ways to say refrigerator, a lot of people refer to it as frigidaire in Spanish, of course, because of its name. And the wawa. This is often referred to as a bus, not the autobus, of course, but the Wawa. And that's because Wa and Wa Co Bus was the first company to actually be in Cuba to provide buses. And so everyone just associated that large vehicle as a Wawa. And sometimes it won't work. For example, this lady, um, it looks embarrassed, but you would never say that she's embarazada because that means that she's pregnant, not that she's embarrassed. So there are times very much socially and culturally where that would not work, where you don't want to just add an A to the end of a word and be like, that's it. And this is exactly why you just can't just start translating things into Spanish. It doesn't quite work that way. And use of formalities, well, that depends on every culture. But I will tell you that using tú is probably the most informal way of referring to somebody and not always offensive, but could be offensive in some cultures. Usted is normally used as someone you don't know, you don't recognize, or someone who's older as a formal gesture. And vos in like Cuban culture is never used. It's extremely formal. So for me, if I were to refer to, an older couple, I would refer to them as usted. But if I refer to this lady, if I referred to her as usted, she would have my head because this is my grandma, and I would never refer to her as usted. She's a tú because we're formal. However, that's a Cuban culture. I know in common Mexican culture, abuelas would still be usted, and that's just a sign of respect. So, really, kind of, I would err on the side of caution and just probably preemptively call everybody usted because it's probably safer that way. And I know that Sarah talked about this, so I'll just skip this away about how in Spanish animals make different sounds as well. And this is kind of the data I wanted to show you. This is kind of the take-home message for me is Spanish-speaking patients tend to perform better when using English babble, and that makes sense. So sometimes we test people and we test them in background noise, but we don't actually have Spanish background noise. When we test someone in English, we have people speaking English in the background, so that's really challenging of a situation. We don't quite have Spanish background noise. So what happens is that if you look here, our Spanish testers already hit ceiling in quiet. This is the Spanish sentence test in quiet, and they're already hitting ceiling. There's no variability. It's way too easy. Whereas our English test in quiet, look at the variability. It ranges from 20% to 100%. That's huge. In fact, to get close to that variability, you have to test a Spanish speaker at a 0 dB SNR. And what that means is both the speech and the noise are at the same level. It's a very challenging, noisy condition. And that's how we have to see Spanish speakers perform to an English and quiet. It's actually crazy that we actually have to make that correlation. The same thing goes for words. Our Spanish words, there's a much higher ceiling effect than our English words. As you can see here, they just naturally perform better. And then the same thing with our sentences. This is the English sentence in quiet. And look at the Spanish sentences in quiet. They have ceiling from the beginning. And there's really just such a huge discrepancy that in fact the closest performance to the English in quiet is, like I said, the Spanish testing at a 0 dB SNR, which is huge. And audiologists, unfortunately, we surveyed them, them being me too, and out of 151 surveyed audiologists who claim to work with Spanish speaking children, 54% of them said that they actually don't test, they will write could not test for a child who speaks Spanish for the ages of 2 to 7, which is huge. These are prime language developing years, and they're not assessing language understanding despite hearing loss. And a lot of it is they don't have the resource, they don't know how to use the resource, and they don't, or they don't have access to the resource. And so, where to start? There's a lot of videos here on how to use interpreters for testing. There's a lot of tips. There's videos here. I quickly just want to show this one. This is me testing a child in Arabic, actually. I don't speak Arabic, full disclosure. And the child is laughing at me, but I'm actually making it work. I'm working with a speech therapist who knows the words he knows, and we're doing a picture pointing test. This just gives me a lot of humility, but I just for examples to show. He's laughing at me. Can you guys hear the audio? No audio. Hold on. Let me stop sharing really quick. It's probably my fault when I press share. Share computer sound. Here we go. All right, let's try again. Tell me if you hear this now.
Yay! Good job.
I don't speak Arabic.
Elbab. Elbab. Yeah.
I'm surprised myself when he does it correctly because I'm like, oh, who knew?
Shorab. Listen. Shorab. Yeah, good job, bud.
He's just casually eating some Fritos. It's fine.
How do I say this one? Tagia?
Taquilla, yes, sorry.
Tagia. Is that funny? Taguilla. What? Better. Thank you.
And so that's just an example. I'm someone who doesn't speak Arabic, but I definitely have tried and I utilize whatever resources I have, whether it's I get a list of the pictures and I ask the interpreter, how do you say these words? And then I will ask them to identify them so I have an understanding of what that child understands as well. And then obviously you guys just did a whole series on therapy, but our auditory verbal therapist has been doing AVT via telehealth for since 2012. And so these are just snippets of tools that she's done. I'm not going to show this video. They do it in Russian as well. This is performing AVT in Russian. The interpreter is actually off the screen. This is mom, our patient, and our therapist. And then the only last thing I want to do is that this was a language sample sent to me. I don't assign language samples to patients. My therapist does, but the mom sent it to me because she was so proud of how he was hearing and how he was developing speech. And this is just probably a great way to end this presentation. If you want to see Jorge baking a cake.
¿Qué estás haciendo, Jorge? ¿Qué estás haciendo? Mix. You're mixing. Estoy mezclando para hacer el cake. Sí, mira, ¿qué es lo que es esto, Jorge? Es agua. Good. Por aquí ahí, bueno. Ok, están los dos. ¿Qué hacen? ¿Qué estás haciendo? What you doing? You want chocolate. You eating. Estás comiendo. ¿Cómo te dice? Estoy comiendo chocolate.
And so this mom is obviously a great mom, very, very obviously invested in her child's language development. And I just love how she goes back and forth between English and Spanish. We know that two languages are possible. Sometimes they get blended. That's okay. These kids end up speaking a little version of Spanglish before they kind of quite get both of them right in terms of fluency. And to end, of course. Oh, sorry, I had some bad audio. Sorry about that. I don't know what's happening. I think it's been the theme of my Zoom presentations. But all that was like a language sample of him baking a cake and mom obviously stimulating him in both English and Spanish, and he was responding in both English and Spanish. And really, the wrap up is for me, when in doubt, try it out. If you don't try, you'll never know. It may not be easy or comprehensive, but it's something. It's really all about teamwork for here. Together, we can work on eliminating the could not test of the world. I don't like looking at an audiogram and saying could not test just because the child speaks Spanish. There are possibilities, and there's really options for and resources that do exist for testing. And sometimes it does take you coming out of your comfort zone a little bit, or taking you a little bit more to trust an interpreter, so to speak, or maybe a family member to help with testing, or a staff member, but it is possible. And if you really want an idea of how they're understanding, it's crucial to obtain this measurement. Use the family, get the interpreter, get everybody involved. It's all about teamwork. And I want to give special thanks to the UMER Institute who provides feedback, and obviously they are incredibly passionate about serving these populations. We have our social media where we feature our patients quite often, and that is all from me with 3 minutes to spare. This is the home stretch. We have just a wrap up and we're all done. Let me see here. I'm going to stop sharing my screen really quick. Alrighty. Let's see here. Yes, I can write down my contact information here. You can email me. There's that. If you have any questions, can you guys hear me? Oh, okay. It's telling me that my microphone's not working, so there's that. Does anyone else have any questions? We have about 2 minutes until, oh wait, we are in the main room, so we get to stay here. Is that right, Jillian? Perfect. We did it, everybody. Woohoo! Yeah, I think actually after these there's a 15-minute break actually. So I think you guys are, if there's no more questions, there's 4:15 is the time to be back. And then that'll be the final wrap up. All right, thank you everybody.
Hey, Jill. Hi.